We are pleased once again this year in this program to begin with an introduction to the U.S. system. Admittedly, as is referenced in those opening comments, the U.S. system is one that is complex, mystifying, and hopefully extremely meaningful to watch in action.
And I want to just start off by emphasizing a point that was made earlier, which is that we have a very complicated electoral system. We have some basic electoral laws, but by and large, our system is very complex. At the federal level, there are some basic rules, and Doug will be talking about them in a little bit, but you should remember that we do have 50 different state laws that govern elections, and the District of Columbia has its own election laws. There are about 10,000 local jurisdictions in the U.S. that actually administer the elections on a local level, and then there are about 100,000 polling places across the U.S. And as Doug and I like to note, that every state thinks that the way they do it is the right way to do it, and everybody thinks that every other state is crazy. And if you actually think about how elections are done, it's often the case that it's the poll workers in the polling place who decide how the elections are run because they do things the way they're going to do them. And that's an interesting aspect of elections. So in this election on Tuesday, there's no presidential race, but we do have a set of Senate races. A third of the U.S. Senate is up for election every 2 years. And this year, there are also 3 special elections. And so in 2 of the states, they're actually having both of their Senate elections this year. And then those terms will be shortened, and they will run for re-election whenever that normal term would expire. We also have elections, obviously, for all of our House districts across the U.S. So every state, their House elections will be going on for the U.S. House of Representatives. And then we have a set of governor's races going on as well. And most states do hold gubernatorial elections in off years. And so in addition to the states that have elections this year, there are 5 states that hold elections in odd-numbered years because most states don't want their state governor's race to be competing with the presidential election in their state at the same time. And the other thing to keep in mind, though, in the U.S. is that we don't just elect people to be president and represent us in Congress or be our chief executive at the state level. We also like to elect other people, like sheriffs who run law enforcement at the local level. We like to elect school board members because we just like to elect people. These people are all on the ballot that you have in your in the electoral primer. They elect the county executive, so the person who runs the counties. They elect the state attorney, so the attorney general for the states get elected. So in the U.S., we tend to have quite a few elective offices. In the state of Washington, they elect members to the Mosquito Abatement Board. I'm not really sure how you run for the Mosquito Abatement Board, if you have a pro-mosquito platform or an anti-mosquito platform, but they elect people to a Mosquito Abatement Board. And in the U.S., we basically have 2 parties. We have the Democratic Party, which is represented by the donkey, and the Republican Party, which is represented by an elephant. Do not ask me why they picked these animals. I'll have to Google it, so I don't know. And the thing to remember about the U.S. is that we have winner-take-all elections, so you have to get roughly 50% of the vote to win an election normally. And what that means is it's very difficult for us to have third parties. There actually is a prohibition on there being proportional representation. So states can't do it at the federal level. You can have proportional representation if a state wanted to have it, but at the federal level, we don't have that. And so what we end up with are primarily 2 major political parties, Democrats and Republicans. And when there are third parties, like we had a third party run for office in 1992 that was pretty prominent, and what the parties did was they just co-opted that party's platform, and so it went away. And so in the U.S., we just basically have the 2 parties.
Thank you very much. Again, it's an honor to be here. My name is Dougchapin. I am from I actually live here in the D.C. area, but work with the University of Minnesota on a program designed to train the next generation of people in our country to do the work that many of you do in your countries, run elections for our citizens. I often tell audiences that outside of family, my favorite people in the world are election officials, and so I'm delighted to be with all of you and delighted that you could travel so far to be with us for our national elections here in 2014. What I'd like to do next is talk a little bit about the laws governing voting rights in the United States, and then segue a little bit into how elections are administered, and then I will turn it back over to Thad for a little more specific information about how Americans cast their ballots across the country. Initially, when the United States was founded back in the late 1700s, the right to vote in this country was concentrated in the hands of people who looked like me, white males, usually with some kind of property qualification. Over the 200-plus years of the United States history, we have seen the right to vote, what we call the franchise, expand steadily, although not always smoothly, to include more and more individuals who are now eligible to vote. The first were women. In the 1920s, women pressed for the right to vote in federal elections. Many states had already allowed women to cast ballots in state and local elections, but in the 1920s, the 19th Amendment to our Constitution allowed women to cast ballots in federal elections. Then the right to vote of racial minorities, especially African Americans, was guaranteed. That, as many of you who have studied American history know, is a very difficult and hard-fought part of our nation's history. After our Civil War in the 1860s, African Americans were guaranteed the right to vote, but that right to vote was often not honored in many places in this country. That right was finally enshrined both in the Constitution and in federal law in our 1960s through something called the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been revised and extended over time to include other minorities, including Hispanic, Latino voters, Asian and Pacific Islanders, our Native Americans, and others. And while I won't give you the full graduate seminar on the current state of voting rights enforcement in this country, we do have a wide range of protections for a wide range of people of both ethnic and language minorities in the United States. We then expanded the right to vote to younger Americans. The idea, especially during the Vietnam War, was that with young people fighting and dying in Vietnam, that those same kinds of people ought to have an opportunity to cast a ballot in federal elections, and so the right to vote was extended to 18-year-olds in the early 1970s. We also have some federal laws which don't necessarily expand to a specific class of people, but which are designed to protect the opportunity to cast a ballot by certain groups of people. One are military and overseas voters. Obviously, United States military is in many places around the world, and those are men and women and their families serving far from home. We also have lots of Americans who are active in NGOs or other for-profit entities in many countries around the world, and the federal government has a fairly active program to ensure that those individuals have the opportunity not only to receive but to cast and have a ballot count in their home jurisdictions. In the early 1990s, the United States passed something called the National Voter Registration Act. Many of you, if you talk to election officials in this country, will hear it referred to as motor voter, largely because the main part of that law involved allowing voters who interact with government in other areas, like obtaining their driver's license, have an opportunity to register their, to vote or to update their voter registration at that public agency. In recent years, we've seen increasing push to see that same law enforced at other federal and state agencies, especially those providing social services and other poverty-related benefits in many communities across the country. And then finally, after our 2000 presidential election, which some of you may have heard was somewhat controversial in this country and around the world, Congress enacted a law called the Help America Vote Act of 2002. And what it was designed to do was upgrade our voting laws and our voting machines so that you never had to see an individual peer through his glasses at a ballot like the individual on this slide. The most notable part of that, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, was that for the first time in our nation's 200-plus year history, the federal government spent money in direct support of state and local administration of elections. Until passage of this law in 2002, the federal government had never made money available to states and localities to run their elections, even though federal offices, President, Vice President, U.S. Senate, and the House of Representatives, are all elected on state and local ballots. So let's talk about how elections are administered in this country. I want to disagree a little bit with the notion that our system is crazy. I often refer to the American electoral system as, depending on your faith tradition, a stained glass window or a mosaic. Our country is divided into many smaller pieces of geography. And each of those pieces of geography often has a very different culture, local makeup, access to resources, and the like. And although in a small area it may seem that many of the jurisdictions do things differently, when you step back, I think there really is, although there is variety, there's a tremendous amount of beauty in the way in which elections are administered in this country. And in some ways, there is a lot of there's a lot of beauty in that, and a lot of opportunity for jurisdictions to make sure that their election system suits their local community. But what does that look like in kind of the big picture? We really have three levels of election administration, maybe four, but I'll say three in this country. The first is at the federal level. As you've already heard or probably already know, we do not have a single federal agency dedicated to administration of elections in this country. We do not have, like many countries do, a national election commission or election authority. And in fact, at the federal level, we have three agencies which are heavily involved in administration of elections at the federal level. The first is the United States Election Assistance Commission, which was created by the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which serves basically as a clearinghouse for new ideas and best practices in election administration across the country, and also serves as the final authority on issues involving the National Voter Registration Act, or motor voter. The second, to the far right, is the Federal Election Commission, which is largely responsible for campaign finance in this country. The FEC is responsible for collecting data on what is being spent by candidates and campaigns and others on campaigns in this country, and making that available to media and other players in the field so that they know who is funding whom on and before Election Day. And finally, and I would argue probably currently the most important federal agency with regard to election administration in this country, is the United States Department of Justice. The Department of Justice, or DOJ as we know it, is the agency which has primary enforcement authority for the full range of federal voting laws in our country. So whether or not there are disputes about whether or not a local jurisdiction is making voting materials available in languages other than English, if there are issues about whether or not a military voter abroad is getting his or her ballot on time, whether there are arguments about whether or not a new law disenfranchises voters of color, DOJ is usually the one enforcing those laws. At the state level, we have 50 states plus entities like the District of Columbia, which, while not recognized as states, function a lot like them in that they have smaller units of government beneath them. Thad already laid out the long laundry list of officials for whom we vote on Election Day. We also vote in many states for our chief election official on Election Day. This evening I'll be traveling back to the University of Minnesota to work with students on Minnesota's election, and one of the biggest and most competitive races on the Minnesota ballot in 2014 is the position of Secretary of State, an individual who has tremendous authority over how, where, and how much money is spent on elections in that state. And the vast majority of states have an individual like a Secretary of State or a Lieutenant Governor who is elected in part to administer elections in their state. And then finally we have, and this is where I think that stained glass window or mosaic comes into mind, we have 10,000 plus jurisdictions in this country. Cities, counties, villages, pretty much wherever two or more people are gathered in the name of democracy, you can have a local election unit. And there you can have clerks or registrars or sheriffs or probate judges, a whole range of local officials at the state and local level involved with Election Day. And then finally, you have, as Thad has already mentioned, and I think this is really important, especially given what you're going to see on Tuesday, in many ways, the most important election jurisdiction on Election Day is the polling place. The poll worker or election judge is the person with whom a voter interacts, verifies his or her eligibility, receives a ballot, casts that ballot, and then is assured that that ballot will be counted. So the 100,000 plus polling places we have across the country may be the smallest, but are definitely the most important level of election administration in this country. And now with just a little bit more detail on what you might see in those polling places on Tuesday, I'll turn it back over to Thad.
So let me talk a little bit about how we vote in the U.S. And so the important thing to remember is that there are certain federal standards that are required for voting. And so if we look at polling places in the U.S., one of the things that you will note is that there are requirements for disability access. People with disabilities, people in wheelchairs, people who have who are language minorities, for instance. So if you look at the ballot that's printed in your primer, you'll see it's a bilingual ballot. It's in both the English and Spanish, because there are requirements under the Voting Rights Act for certain jurisdictions to have ballots in multiple languages. And other jurisdictions often have translators in polling places, even if they're not required, just for that customer service component of it. Polling places are also, there's all sorts of buildings that we use for polling places, and it's kind of interesting to note this. We vote in school buildings and public buildings that you would expect, like courthouses. We also vote in, a variety of other places. And so for in-person voting, we vote across, a variety of different places. People can vote in a variety of ways. First of all, in addition to polling place voting, we have what we refer to as early voting or in-person early voting. That's normally 2 weeks prior to the election in a limited number of locations. And the purpose of this is to give people a chance to vote if they aren't going to be able to vote on Election Day, because our Election Day is on a Tuesday, and that's not the most convenient time to vote. But we've never figured out how to change that exactly. And so one of the innovations that has happened recently, and this started in Colorado, are what we refer to as vote centers. And the way vote centers work is it basically builds on the idea of what major retailers do. So if you think about grocery stores and things like that, they know exactly where to build their locations because they know where traffic flows are. They know where people go to get to work, how they commute to and from work. And the idea of a vote center is that you have a limited number of polling places, but they are in very well-located areas with lots of parking, where it's easy for people to get in and out. And in Colorado, they've actually found that that is one of the few reforms that actually boosts turnout among people who would not normally vote by a small amount. The other thing we do as well in the U.S. is that we have postal voting. And so in Oregon, Washington State, and in Colorado, they have primarily vote-by-mail elections. There are also states, most states have what we refer to as no-excuse absentee voting. So you just ask your election official for an absentee ballot, and they will have one sent to you. And in the state where I live, in Utah, and many other states also, you can become a permanent absentee voter. And once you designate yourself a permanent absentee voter, ballots just come to you automatically. So you never have to ask for an absentee ballot again, it just shows up. Which is very convenient when there are weird elections you're not expecting, like that local school board race or the bond referendum, because we like our elections in the U.S. And so that's one of the advantages of postal voting. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is that we vote using different technologies. This is an optical scan ballot. And so basically you bubble in next to the person's name, and then you put it through the ballot, through a reader so it can be scanned for errors, and then it's tabulated at the same time. And as Doug can tell you, if you ever see what people can do with a paper ballot, I don't know about in your countries, but in America, you give people a pen and a piece of paper, and they can do all sorts of crazy things with a paper ballot. People will write things on them, they'll vote twice, they'll scratch things out. So having this redundancy of telling people if they've made mistakes is very important. And then we obviously have electronic voting machines. These are touchscreen voting machines. They're designed to let people make selections electronically. This is how I voted, before I came here, I voted with my son, and he pushes all the buttons for me, so I don't have to actually do it. And the nice thing about electronic voting machines is you can easily display multiple languages. It's also more accessible for people with disabilities, and so that's an advantage to them as well. And you'll notice on the side of this machine where the black bar is, that's actually a screen. There's a screen on the other side of it, and it is where there's a paper record of your voting. So we have an electronic record and a paper record as well with our electronic voting machines. One of the interesting things about voting in the U.S. is that we have different states can set their own polling place hours. So in the 3 jurisdictions that are right here, they all have different, they all have different start close times, and so they're not all open at the same time, especially between Virginia and the other 2 states. And so you can see that we don't have uniformity in how this works. So states get to decide when they close. In Florida, Doug, is it still the case that they're in 2 time zones? So
That's
two
correct.
Closing times. So the state of Florida is in 2 time zones, and so half of their polling places close at 8 o'clock. But it closes at 8 o'clock in one jurisdiction, and then an hour later, the rest of the polling places close. So even in a state, they vary. This is an example of voting in a school gymnasium. So you can see this. You will actually see some of this when you go to polling places. We saw this in 2012. They'll be voting in polling places that'll be in schools. We have voting in fire stations. I'm not really sure what happens if there's a fire, but that I'm sure would be pretty exciting. And this is my favorite photo of all time. This is a Kmart, which is a kind of a retail store, and they set up the polling place in the lingerie department, which was phenomenal. So I just took the picture. I was just like, this is too good. So when you think about voting, we vote in all sorts of crazy places. We also have 2 different kinds of ballots that we can vote on. And so our ballots are designed so that they're blocks. So they're called candidate blocks. So you can see that each of the races is in a block, and you just select from each of the blocks, and you vote on each of the races. We also have what are referred to as straight party ballots. And so on this one, if you look at where it says straight party option on the side, you can see that right next to it there's a box that says straight party. You just pick your party, and then you're considered to have voted for all the partisan races on the ballot. And it's designed to just make things easier so that you can just support your team right off the bat. So let me talk a little bit about who can vote. In the U.S., first of all, you have to be registered to vote before you can vote. And we have varying registration laws by state. The primary variation is when the deadline is for being registered. In many states, it's 30 days prior to the election. There are a limited number of states who have election day voter registration. In those states, you can register on election day and then cast your ballot. We also have, and so these are the states with election day registration, and then the state of North Dakota has no voter registration, although they have a voter registry, but it's very complicated, and so
Well, they have same-day
this is their,
same-day
it's like same-day registration, but if you tell them it's like same-day registration, they get mad.
If any of you ever figure out how North Dakota actually has a registration list without actually registering people to vote, please explain it to Thad and I, because we've yet to get a good explanation.
Right. But if you say that they have voter registration, their Secretary of State will go bananas, and so I'm just doing what they tell me. We also have voter ID laws. Under the Help America Vote Act, all first-time registrants are required to show an identification that they are who they are when they register to vote. Then there are states with variations in the strictness of their voter ID laws. And so some states have pretty strict ID laws, so you have to show a photo ID that meets certain requirements. In some states, you just state your name. We've done some research that shows that often the voting rules just vary on how poll workers feel that day and if they want to ask people for ID or don't. But in general, these are the 2 groups. There are states with photo ID laws and states that don't have them. We also have laws on whether or not people can vote if they've been convicted of a felony. There are states where you can actually vote if you're in prison. You can always vote if you're in prison, if you're in a jail and you've not been sentenced. But these are for people who have been sentenced. And then there are a small number of states who, even if you've completed your sentence and you've completed all your probation or parole and your sentence is completely done, you still can never vote. And the interesting thing is this: if you committed a felony For instance, in the state of Maine, which allows people to vote even in prison, and you move to Florida, because you were a felon in one of those states, you can never vote in Florida. You'd have to get your rights given back to you. So we have and so this is one of those places where variation is really important.
And very quickly, and for those of you who might not be experts on United States criminal law, a felony is any offense for which the punishment is 1 year in prison or greater. And that, like everything else, can vary from state to state. So if you were to use a counterfeit bill or a bad check to make a purchase, you could be convicted of a felony in one state, but not necessarily in another. You can also commit a felony, but as a result of the criminal process, only be charged with and convicted of a misdemeanor. So the stained glass window gets even more complex and either more or less beautiful depending on your point of view. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, that was very helpful. Doug has the advantage of also being a lawyer, and so I don't hold that against him, though.
I'm in recovery, though.
Exactly. And then finally, we have rules to make sure that people with disabilities can vote. So in the top, you see there's an elderly person who can, they can plug in the, if on most electronic voting machines, you can plug in headsets and they can talk to you and you can hear, it'll read the ballot to you very slowly. And then we also have what, in some places, what we refer to as curbside voting, where they will bring the ballot out to you and you can vote the ballot and then you go back in. That way the voter doesn't have to get out of their car and go to their polling place, go into the polling place. And this can often make it much easier for people to be able to actually participate because it just takes the burden of them walking. And if you think about people who are elderly, that's often an issue of mobility. So I want to talk now about who votes in the U.S. And so first of all, one of the important things to remember is that this is an election that is, it's an off-year election. There's no presidential race. So our turnout will be much lower in this election than it would be in a presidential race. And in the primer, I have some examples that show this. And if you look at voting in the U.S., one of the things that will not surprise you is old people vote a lot and young people don't. And if you've ever, Doug and I both worked on Capitol Hill, and these are the same people who also write letters and send emails and call, and they really care about politics. And so it's not surprising we see people who are older participate more. You also see that being registered is very important. People, once you can get them registered, most people who are registered will vote, but it's getting people registered. And a lot of people don't vote because they just don't like the process. They don't think that the two parties are very different, or they don't think that the parties represent them. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of participation necessarily. There are variations in participation by race. Not surprisingly, Barack Obama's election has boosted turnout among African Americans a lot. So historically, African Americans did not turn out in very high numbers necessarily, and his election has changed that dramatically. But we do have, the biggest variation, and I don't have it up here because there aren't really good census data on this, but we know this from other surveys, is that, the number one predictor of whether or not you're going to vote or not is if you're a partisan. If you are a member, if you support one of the two parties, you're going to turn out. Politics in America, it's like sports, right? You like your team, and you turn out for your team. And so that is the number one thing that, boosts turnout, is people being actively involved with one of the parties. The other thing, obviously, is that there are, strong correlations between voting and education, voting and income, and then people with disabilities vote at slightly lower rates than people who don't have disabilities. And the key thing here is mobilization, and I have this photo that I want to show in just a second. But first of all, one of the ways that we mobilize people is, and the most effective way, is when people go door to door. So you hear a lot probably about the use of the internet in politics. The biggest way that the internet gets used in politics today is for me to identify, or as a party, to identify the key people that can get you to vote. So what I want to do is send an email to Doug and say, Doug, can you contact these 5 people? And they've, the Obama campaign, for instance, in 2012, knew who Doug's 5 friends were who were in battleground states, who were most likely to participate. but they weren't necessarily mobilized. And so one of the ways that we use the internet is not necessarily, you know, obviously we use them for like ads and things like that, but the primary way we use it is actually to connect people and to get people to be mobilized. And face-to-face mobilization is the best way to mobilize people. Somebody you know telling you to vote. And so they tend to try to identify people in neighborhoods, political parties do, and then have them go out. And these people are much more effective than, for instance, having just general canvassers do it, people who are paid to do this. You want to get people to actually volunteer and do it, because face-to-face is very effective. Parties do phone banks, so they call. They're often what we call robocalls, so they'll be recorded calls, which are really annoying. And then, and so this is from Ohio in 2012, but this is from Michael's mailbox in the last 2 days. You know, last 2 days, he's gotten all of this. And some of these are great. There's like a, you know, there were some great attack ads in here, you know, so, you know, there's this guy he's fighting for crime, you know, you have to like this. And, you know, his other candidate, by the way, loves criminals, clearly, you know. And so these are the kind of ads that you get. And so, you know, you get these kind of scary sort of looking things, and you just get buried in these. And it's interesting, one of the reasons why people early vote in many states is because when you early vote, they check off that you voted, and then parties will stop sending you this stuff. And they'll stop calling you, because they'll just go, oh, we've already sent it to him. And so you can save your mailbox and yourself lots of phone calls late at night. And that's really important. So I'm going to turn it back over to Doug, and he's going to explain to you what happens after we hold elections.
Thank you. And I will tell you that it isn't just direct mail. I have a daughter who is currently away at college, and we have been getting a steady diet of phone calls to the house asking if Sarah, is her name, was going to get an absentee ballot and if she had cast it. And I heard from her the other day that she had returned it, and she, being the daughter of an election fanatic like me, actually sent me a screenshot of her official, your ballot has been received. And so we had a call a couple days ago, and I told the person that she had received a ballot, she had voted her ballot, and I had evidence that it had been received. We have not received any phone calls since then. So as they say, the best way to make politicians go away is to just vote. So what happens, we often think about elections and election day as being the finish line or the final act of an election. And those of you who work in elections know, of course, that isn't true, that the real work of democracy is just as much tied up in the counting as it is in the casting of ballots. But in this country, one thing that the 2000 presidential election did was that it made the broader public and really the popular media aware that elections didn't end on election night. And so we have a much better appreciation, if not yet understanding, of what can happen after election day is over. If a result is clear and there are no problems with the casting or counting of ballots, often it will take anywhere from 3 to 28 days to what's called certify an election, provide the certificate of election that declares the winner. But that's only if nothing goes wrong or the margin is not close. If something goes wrong or the margin is close, one of two things can happen. The first is a recount. And I know that that process goes by different names in different languages. But when I talk to my students about understanding what a recount is, it is, as the English word would suggest, a recount. We go back through all the ballots and we make sure whether or not the vote totals that we arrived at in the first round of counting are actually the correct totals. Sometimes they change. Machines make mistakes, people make mistakes, boxes get lost or mislaid, but a recount is designed quite simply to retabulate the ballots that were cast on and before Election Day and determine whether or not the final numbers support the initial result. And different states, again, not surprisingly, have different rules about who can request such a recount, when it must be requested, how long it can take, and most importantly, who will pay for it. Some states have very strict rules about who can request a recount. Increasing number of states, though, are making available through state law what's known as an automatic recount, which really is a recount where when the election is so close that a recount is almost required, neither side has to pay for that recount, that the state is willing to bear the cost of counting those ballots again in the interest of making sure that the result is true. Different states have different margins for when that law applies, but more and more when an election is truly close, like it was in 2000 for the United States presidency, most states will allow for what's known as an automatic recount. You can also have problems with election process. Where something goes wrong, either a mistake happens or there are allegations of some kind of bad act. And when that happens, you can have an argument that while the numbers may be correct, that they do not reflect the true will of the people who cast their ballots on election day. And then you can end up with what's called an election contest or a protest, depending on state laws. Those are usually judicial proceedings where one party or one candidate will come in and say, we know that the final totals show that I lost by 100,000 votes, but I have evidence that there were power failures in my strongholds or there were improper activities on the part of election officials, and then a court has to decide whether or not to invalidate that election and order a new one or take some other kind of remedial action. Interestingly enough, though, for members of Congress, the United States Senate and the House of Representatives, that judicial body is Congress itself. So if there is a dispute about who won a disputed U.S. Senate election, or if there is a dispute about a close House election, while there may be some initial state or local judicial proceedings, ultimately the body which will seat the representative has the final say on whether or not the winner is actually the winner. And it will probably shock none of you to learn that often politics plays a role in that process. And so if you are a winning candidate in one of those races, you want to do everything you can to try and win in the courts before it gets into the congressional body, because then it becomes a far less predictable event. After that, really, once elections are done, election officials move on to the next election, in most of the jurisdictions, including the 3 that you all are visiting on Tuesday, I would be willing to bet that there will be another election within 2 to 3 months of the one that you view on Tuesday. And there are some states, like California on the West Coast, where if it is Tuesday, someone is voting somewhere. And so all of this stuff that we're talking about today happens again and again and again, weekly, monthly, in many jurisdictions across the country. And now I'm going to use my stop sign, and we'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Thad, for that very comprehensive and succinct overview of the U.S. election system and systems. As I understood, the first question we had regarded the capacity, the election administration at the local level in terms of elected, appointed, is that correct? Yes. Okay. So the judges, the polling station officials that you mentioned.
Thank you. So elections in the U.S., as we've pointed out, they are governed by state laws. And in some states, there are basically a couple of ways elections can be run at the local level. There often is an elected person who is in charge of elections, so it's an elected county clerk or something, or a position like that. There are also election boards in some jurisdictions, and so if you go to in Virginia, there's also a registration board and then an elections board, and so sometimes those two jobs are separated. So elections is just one aspect of the job they do. In Los Angeles County, the elections person in charge of elections is also in charge of business licensing. And so you can imagine that this is just one aspect of a very big job. And so the capacity issue can be a problem, especially in a small jurisdiction. So we have, a lot of large cities. So for instance, Los Angeles has more voters than all but 9 states. But most election jurisdictions are very small. They have about 2,000 to 3,000 voters. And so in those places, elections is just one job of many that these people are dealing with, and so capacity can be a problem. Fortunately, there are really good organizations that help election officials. There are a variety of local election organizations that help these people know what they need to be doing, and most Secretary of State's offices provide some sort of assistance to localities as well to make sure that things run smoothly. And then at the polling place level, all states have some sort of polling place training that they provide to election workers. And one of the interesting things that has happened since the 2000 election is that there has actually been somewhat of a switch in who are poll workers in some jurisdictions, because there's been more technology, and so a lot of the really old people that were operating as poll workers quit doing it because it just got too complicated, and so there's actually been an influx of younger poll workers. And it varies by jurisdiction how good they are at recruiting people. On the other question had to do with two things. One was turnout and gender. And in the U.S., and if you look in on page 20 of the primer, you'll see that in 2010, the last time we had a midterm election, women turned out at a higher rate than men. Women tend to be registered at higher rates and to vote at higher rates than men. The other issue she brought up had to do with polling places, and one aspect of it was, when you go to a polling place on Tuesday, you'll see signs for the candidates somewhere near the building, but not right at the building. And basically, there is in general a 100-foot rule, 200-foot rule, that you can't campaign outside of that inside that distance, but outside of it, you can do all the campaigning you want to. So people will literally give, parties and candidates will give their election worker or their campaign people pieces of string that are that long, and they'll stand at the door and they go out that far and then they put their signs out so that they can know when they can campaign and hand out things. And so you'll see this in DC, Virginia, Maryland, and all of them. And she also asked a question about exit polling. And in the US, people can be exit polled. It's a free speech issue. And so you can pretty much exit poll people outside of that distance. And so as long as they're not in the polling place itself, generally, you're allowed to conduct exit polling. And you'll see this is how the projections for the election will be done, is based on exit polling. And so that's how we do them.
Great. Thank you. Also, electioneering, the prohibition against electioneering happening in the polling station. We don't have a tradition or a practice of a quiet period before elections. You'll see, if you turn on the television tonight in your room, you'll see campaign ads being broadcast. People will continue to get these in the mail on Monday, to fill up their mailbox on Monday, and public opinion polls will still be solicited and released up until Election Day, to take advantage of every minute until the ballots are cast. The second set of questions, Doug, I'd like you to address is this question about recounts and who pays, but also the protests. And the question was asked about how long and what challenges does that present for a contested election in terms of seating the winner or the presumed winner in office and so forth.
Of course, I want to jump in on the electioneering question for our lawyer from Argentina, any of the rest of you who are lawyers. Very quickly, normally under the United States Constitution, jurisdictions are not allowed to impose what's called prior restraint. They're not allowed to stop speech before it happens, but the courts in the United States have ruled that the need for voters to cast their ballots in a relatively quiet place justifies what's known as an electioneering bubble of different lengths in different jurisdictions. And so when I cast my early ballot last week, there was a little blue piece of tape, and as I started to walk toward the polling place, several campaign people started heading toward me, all talking at once, and I somewhat mischievously jumped inside the blue line and smiled back at them as if to say, you can't get me now. And I've got the courts on my side, so thank you. A couple of questions. I want to actually start with the question about recounts. I talked about whether or not an individual is responsible for paying. Who pays? The person who actually writes the check or makes the money available is usually either a candidate or his or her committee, sometimes a political party. Under our very complicated campaign finance laws, there is essentially no limit on the amount of money that can be spent on recounts. And so often candidates will raise tremendous amounts of money to have available in the event of a recount. One thing I will point out, though, is that most candidates, when they do ask for a recount, are asked to post a bond, and if the result changes, they get that money back, so that the jurisdiction takes the risk of being wrong. With regard to the question about how long it takes to resolve election protests, it depends on the case. There are some jurisdictions that work very hard to get it done quickly. In the state of Minnesota, where we had a very close Senate race in 2008, it took actually 6 months for the entire legal process to resolve. So it can be as quickly or not as the facts dictate. One thing, again, for those of you who are lawyers in the room or have to work with lawyers, there is a much higher standard for protests in this country. Usually, someone asking for a post-election challenge has to, as the phrase is, put in doubt a sufficient number of votes to change the outcome. So if you lose by 100,000 votes, and even if you have absolute certain proof that 50,000 votes were invalid, that's not enough to survive a motion to dismiss. You have to put enough votes in doubt to change the outcome. A new area, and then I want to let more questions, is what to do when a protest is upheld. There are some courts that have said that the candidate who lost is actually the winner. Most courts don't like to do that. What usually happens is they invalidate the result and run a brand new election, which all of you can imagine doesn't really solve the problem, because all of the hard feelings that were in the electorate are still there, and the contest itself becomes an issue in the next campaign. But at least the system is designed to try to get to some level of clarity on whether or not Chapin beat Hall or vice versa.
Yes.
And I realized that I did not fully answer the woman from Argentina's question. And I should also point out, she also asked about turnout among the elderly, and she was noting that in Argentina, turnout is somewhat lower because voting is not compulsory after you turn 70. Voting is not compulsory at any time in America. You have the freedom to not vote. And so one of the things that's different about the U.S. compared to many of your countries is that we do not require people to participate at all. And so you are free to just free ride on everybody else's voting.
Yes, we'll have another question or comment from CEO Bill Sweeney.
Doug, one question for you. In some of these countries represented here, we have issues where recounts or election challenges have taken so long that the actual term of office that was in contest, that term has then lapsed before the courts of the process dealt with the issue of the election contest. Does that happen here in the United States?
And we'd like to take 2 more questions in this group. So we have 1 more question on recounts. Yes, one of my colleagues could help the gentleman in the first row. Thank you. Another question? Yes, sir. So, Augusta.
It's on.
Please, please.
عماد السايح من هيئة الانتخابات الليبية.
My name is Ahmad Asayah from the Libyan electoral, and my question to Mr. Doug. Do you think that the U.S. elections have seen any kind of rigging? I wanted to have a full answer, and why is the result of that? Thank you.
My name is Sigit from Indonesia. Maybe it is a sensitive issue. How much salary for federal election and local election office? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Doug, I'd like you to start. We approximately have 5 more minutes we're going to take before going to our afternoon break. But Doug, I'd ask you to address 2 of those questions and ask Tad to wrap up with the last response.
Okay, to answer Mr. Sweeney's question, To date, no, we have not had the lapse issue, although there is concern with regard to United States presidential elections that you could have the result in doubt before the Electoral College is to meet and declare a winner. There are several academics, including a man named Ned Foley in Ohio, who are very concerned about whether or not that will happen. We haven't gotten there yet, but it's certainly worth worrying about. With regard to the gentleman from Libya about rigging, there are allegations of electoral fraud in the United States. Often it involves candidates who are paying individuals to cast ballots. No translation? Go ahead, answer that question, and when they get the translation going, then I'll answer this one.
Sure. So the other question dealt with the salaries of election workers. And in, oh wait, do we need to wait for, do you want to?
Just answer that question.
Okay, so how the salaries are for election workers. Basically, there are two issues here. One is that most election officials are not full-time election officials. They are doing this as part of another part of their job. And so their salaries are based on a variety of things, including that part of their job. But in most cases, so even like if there is an election director, for instance, their salary is just set by whatever the pay scale is for that jurisdiction based on the kind of the qualifications of the job. So it would be set by state law or county law, whatever governs that. It would be a set salary. And then poll workers are generally paid a flat rate for working that varies between about $125 and $250 for the day. And then they often are paid for going to training as well. And so it's a pretty, small amount. We try to get people to do it based on their desire to participate.
Now,
Do we have?
I need to answer this one.
Yes, that's good.
And the quick follow-up on that is that I think the one thing that every election worker in the United States would agree that is that they're not paid enough. But I suspect that's a worldwide problem. To the gentleman from Libya, we do have the issue of fraud in elections in the United States, usually at the local level where one or more candidates is paying voters to cast their ballots a certain way or has influence over the local election authority. We don't really have, to my knowledge, any evidence of a larger scale national problem. In some ways, this stained glass window or mosaic that I discussed guards against that. There's a phrase that computer scientists use, security through obscurity. And the fact that we have thousands of local jurisdictions, it is fiendishly difficult. I won't say impossible because nothing is impossible with enough money and time, but it's fiendishly difficult to affect a national election on the kind of scale. While the United States may be somewhat messy and chaotic with regard to not having a single national entity, at least one of the arguments for the more distributed model is that it makes that kind of central rigging much more difficult. But fraud is something that is very much on the minds of American election administrators, and I don't mean to be facetious when I say often losing candidates are much more willing to see fraud in the process than winning candidates. And one of the things that people like me who have no, as we say in the United States, dog in the fight or investment in the outcome is making sure that democracy stands for the process or for the principle that it helps us tell who the winners are, but most importantly, convinces people who lost that they indeed did lose.
I think that's a very nice point to end on. Thank you very much.